I'm the Nevada Stray Cat, and I've come to Donner Spring, Utah. The spring itself, I think, is that green spot over there. But there's no historical marker, and the spring is now on private land. So, unfortunately, this is the best view we've got.
I spent the last week living in, or at least thinking a great deal about, the year 1846. Why? Well, that's a story. My family name is not Donner, but for the last 30 years, every time someone in a restaurant has asked me, "Can I get a name?" my response has been Donner, just like Santa's reindeer. That habit started with my late wife. It amused her to be called as Donner, party of two, at restaurants, and sometimes, if we'd been waiting for a while, she'd be caught gnawing on my arm. I grew up in an Arizona yeoman's family. My mother, who had a strong interest in genealogy, traced my earliest American ancestors to a pair of brothers of Clan MacDougall, who left Scotland in 1745 because they were on, well, I'm sure they'd say the right side, but alas, the losing side of the Battle of Culloden, a battle to decide if the King of England would be a Scot or a German. My ancestor with the most recent arrival was one of my grandmothers, who came to America as a war bride after World War II. Or maybe it's me, since I was born in Japan. Though that fact, while true, only half counts, because both of my parents graduated from high school in Tucson, and were just sort of accidentally in Japan at the time I was born. It's a thing that happens when Uncle Sam makes your travel plans. My wife, however, grew up in a house in the East Bay of California that had been in her family for over 100 years. One of her ancestors had been a rail baron, or at least a rail baronet, and the family's blood was as blue as American blood gets. Being children of the American Southwest, we knew what everyone knows about the Donner Party, that they got snowed into a pass in the Sierra Nevada mountains and ended up resorting to cannibalism for some of the party to survive. With no more knowledge than that, I felt faint contempt for the party. Trapped in the snow conjured up incorrect images in my head of the snow I'd experienced in places like upstate New York or northern New Jersey. Waist-high snow, perhaps, or, if I was being particularly dramatic, head-high. More than once, I opined to anyone who discussed the subject with me that they were city slickers who'd starved to death in a valley full of food. But this past week, researching for my trip to Donner Spring, I realized something. I was wrong. Deeply, profoundly wrong. To explain why, I have to take you back to 1845. But before I do that, I want to mention that the gasoline I burned making this episode was paid for by a donation from Adam of the YouTube channel Meandering Miles. He used the Ko-fi page I set up for this channel, and if you'd like to support what I do, you can find the link to that page in the description for this episode, as well as in the channel description. Back to history. In 1845, this part of the world was still the property of Mexico. More importantly, California was still the property of Mexico. I've mentioned John C. Fremont in previous episodes as the first person to make detailed maps of the area, which he did in support of the American invasion of California. Fremont employed one of the era's more controversial figures, Kit Carson, as a scout. Carson was illiterate, but also a polyglot who spoke English, Spanish, and several Native American languages. He married 3 times, an Arapaho woman, a Cheyenne woman, and a Mexican woman. yet also owned Native American slaves and took part in at least 2 massacres of Native American peoples in California and Oregon. When Fremont reached the Salt Flats, he didn't know how large they were or where water could be found. He sent Carson ahead to find water, and he found it on the eastern slopes of the tallest peak in the area. Carson built a bonfire to let Fremont know there was water, and that it would be enough for the entire expedition. And in 1845, Fremont published a guide to the area and to the California Trail, which led the following year to the opening of the proverbial floodgates as immigrants from the United States upped stakes and headed for Oregon and California. Unfortunately, Fremont's guide wasn't the only one on the market. A land speculator named Lansford Hastings also published a book called The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California, in which he proposed a route which would shave more than 200 miles off the established California Trail. Unfortunately, Hastings had never made the trip himself. He was relying on hearsay and dubious reports. And that brings us to 1846 and the Donner family. The Donner brothers, George and Jacob, were no babes in the woods. Their father, George Sr., a veteran of the American Revolution, had, over the course of his life, taken the family from Pennsylvania to North Carolina and thence to Kentucky, Indianapolis, and Illinois, each time carving a successful farmstead out of the wilderness before moving on again. In part, that was because the agricultural practices of the day depleted the soil. A 10-year-old farm was never as productive as one freshly carved from the wilderness. But it was also just a wanderlust in the family, a desire ever to press on and see what came next. The Donner brothers were joined in their desire to see California by James Reed, a personal friend and client of a young lawyer named Abraham Lincoln. Yes, that Abraham Lincoln, who considered the trip to California, but decided against it because his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, wouldn't make the journey. Reed was an experienced and savvy merchant who had made the bad decision to invest heavily in a railroad in Illinois at the wrong time. The technology wasn't quite mature, and Reed went bankrupt, which made the prospect of traveling to California and starting over an incredibly attractive one. The Donner brothers and Reed had read both Fremont's book and Hastings. They heard letters from westward departed pioneers read aloud in church services on Sundays, and at least 2 of the 3 knew they had the skills to make a go of a new agricultural farmstead. So they made arrangements, bought wagons and oxen. An ox, by the by, is just a cow, usually a steer, that is large and strong and trained to pull heavy things. They loaded their wagons with the things they'd need to make the crossing of the wilderness, and with trade goods, and with things they'd want in their new home. And they carried cash. The Donner brothers had 10,000 American dollars with them, a secret not even known to their entire family. Those $10,000, adjusted for inflation, would be pretty close to $500,000 today. In April, they set out from Springfield, Illinois, and headed west, as prepared as they could be, as prepared as anyone could be in that spring of 1846. They soon reached Independence, Missouri, where they joined a larger caravan. Though there were comings and goings within the caravan, and the numbers fluctuated, when they left Independence, their caravan consisted of some 46 wagons, of which 9 belonged to the Donners and Reed. Tamsen Donner, wife of George Donner, Jr. and the family's scholar, a botanist, linguist, and educator, said in a letter to her sister in Massachusetts that some 7,000 wagons were expected to start that year on the California, Oregon, or Santa Fe trails, all of which started in Independence. In a later letter, Tamsen estimated that there were probably more than 400 wagons on the California Trail at the same time as her caravan. For most of the early journey, things were reasonably within expectations. People died, people were married, people were born, in the caravan the Donners were part of, and the ones in front of and behind them. But 1846 was an unusually cold year. At the beginning of June, the party experienced a hailstorm, and the snow never completely melted off the western mountains. In late November and early December 2024, I made a very similar trip. I left Knoxville, Tennessee, the Monday before Thanksgiving, and reached Salina, Kansas, which I thought would be my destination, on Wednesday. I spent a week realizing that Salina was not, in fact, my destination, then picked up the Riker I'd bought sight unseen from a dealer in Wichita, and was on the road to my dad's house in Wendover, which took another 3 or 4 days. It's important to remember the difference in scale between 1846 and 2024. The trail, taken by the Donners and Reed, was very similar to the route I took, the modern route of Interstate 80. But where I made an average of 65 miles per hour when I was moving, the Donner-Reed party considered 18 to 20 miles of progress an exceptional day, and 8 to 12 miles perfectly acceptable. So every hour I was on the road, I was covering distance they'd taken 3 days to a week to travel. Every mountain man or experienced trail guide the party met coming back east from the lands they were headed into advised them against taking Hastings' shortcut. But each time, the Donner brothers were convinced that they had little choice but to take what they'd read was the shorter trail. They knew they were behind schedule. Trail wisdom was that a caravan had to reach Independence Rock, in what is today the state of Wyoming, by the 4th of July if they were to arrive safely in California and Oregon before winter. The Donners didn't reach the rock until a week after that date, and as they went further west, they fell further behind schedule. The final crossing of the proverbial Rubicon, however, happened at the end of July at Fort Bridger, Wyoming. There was surprisingly good communication up and down the trail, as travelers would give letters to other travelers, either those going the other direction or those traveling faster in the same direction. And a group of young men had written a letter back to the Donner brothers, advising them not to take the Hastings route, warning them that it was much rougher than Hastings had made it seem. And this letter reached Fort Bridger. 2 words about the word fort seem justified here. Today, in 2025, we think of a fort as a base of the United States Army. When we think of frontier forts, we may think of the old TV series F Troop, if we're of an age to remember F Troop, with sharpened log walls and soldiers in blue uniforms. But those were artifacts of a later time. In 1846, a fort was simply a fortified place owned by Americans, and Fort Bridger was owned by former mountain man and fur trapper Jim Bridger and his business partner Louis Vasquez. The 2 men operated a trading post where wagons could be repaired, supplies could be laid in, and livestock could be traded. Bridger and Vasquez knew that if the Hastings route became popular, traffic to their trading post would increase greatly. So the letter advising against taking that route was never delivered, and the Donner-Reed caravan rested a few days at the fort and then pressed on. At their departure, they were 74 people distributed across 19 wagons, and they estimated they had 700 miles to go to reach Fort Sutter, California, a distance they hoped to cover in 7 weeks. Unfortunately, they ran into trouble almost immediately. They had to hack through brush and groves of desert trees, essentially making their own road. It took them 18 days, 2.5 weeks, to travel the 111 miles between Fort Bridger and the place now called Donner Hill, Utah, overlooking the south end of the Great Salt Lake. In fact, when Brigham Young arrived the following year and proclaimed from the back of the wagon carrying his sickbed that this was the place the Mormons should build their New Jerusalem, his party was following the road the Donners had cut. From Donner Hill, the caravan made decent time again, until they reached the Salt Flats. If you haven't watched my video on the Salt Flats, I encourage you to do so, to consider the immensity, the emptiness, to think about what it meant to look at that desert and think, I can cross this.
Pilot Peak was named for the fact that you can see it all the way across the salt flats, and it would guide you in your crossing between Skull Valley and what we today call Donner Spring. In his book, The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California, Hastings promised that one day and one night of hard work would put you across the salt flats. In fact, it took the Donner Party 3 days, 2 nights, and they lost half their livestock on the way.
In order to avoid the worst of the heat, the caravan waited at the north end of Skull Valley until evening before setting off across the salt, expecting what Hastings had promised. His book said that there was a stretch of 35 or 40 miles across the desert. In reality, the distance was 83 miles. By the third day on the desert, September 2nd, 1846, they were out of water and food for the livestock. James Reed saddled his horse and rode out in front to scout. He told his head teamster to wait until the oxen were about to fall dead in the traces, and then unhitch them and drive them up the trail Reed's horse left, to bring them to water. And at this point, it's worth talking about that word, discovered. The area wasn't as empty as American history is generally painted. There were people living here for centuries, even millennia. The Shoshone, the Ute, the Goshute, all knew where the water was, but no Americans bothered consulting them or recording their knowledge. So to the Donners, as to the rest of English-speaking America, Carson had discovered the water only a couple of years before. Though this isn't the Donner Spring, it's the pond at Lucin, Utah, about 50 miles north. It is indicative of the kind of spring Carson would have discovered by following the traces of greenery on the landscape. And Reed found the spring. He loaded up on water, and going back toward where he'd left the caravan, he encountered the drovers bringing the livestock along. He warned them to take especial care, because when the oxen scented water, they might stampede. His warning delivered, he continued on to the wagons. Unfortunately, exactly what Reed had warned about happened, and many of the oxen which stampeded were never seen again. By nightfall, the party was again out of water and had to abandon their wagons, walking across the desert in the cold of night, wrapped in blankets, to reach the spring. Over the next week, the caravan would realize that they no longer had enough livestock to pull all of their wagons. They also realized that not all of the wagons were in any shape to continue from where they sat on the salt. Hard choices were made, and by September 10th, when the party left the spring, they had lost 36 animals, 4 wagons, and most importantly, 11 days. On that day, as they traveled around the base of Pilot Peak, they were hit by a snowstorm. Maybe they should have turned back and wintered at the spring. They had water there was game nearby, and they could have taken the time to send men back along the trail to Fort Bridger to purchase more livestock. They could have, but they didn't. They were too focused on the goal of reaching California before winter, a goal they were already too late to achieve. But that's a story for another day. I'm the Nevada Stray Cat, and I'll see you around.